This is a Parsha podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Dvarim series, where our theme for these final episodes of the Jewish calendar year is rabbinic interpretations of the Parshiot. We're looking at mitzvot in a biblical context and also exploring where these ideas are taken in the halachic realm. Today's episode is dedicated to Debbie Nussbaum in honor of her birthday, which has unfortunately been shadowed in the last couple of years due to the events on October 7th. But her children would like to bring back the simcha to her Simchat Torah birthday. They and all of us at Matan wish you, Debbie, much simcha and joy in learning Torah and teaching it to your children, grandchildren, and Baruch Hashem, your great-grandchildren. Be in touch with me at podcast@matan.org.il or at the Matan office to sponsor podcasts for the new year. It's a great way to mark your occasion and help this listening community grow. I also want to remind you that if you haven't looked at the Matan schedule for this year, I'd love to learn with you. You can come here. We can learn every week on Mondays, and there's a whole other list of amazing classes that are being offered this year. Parshat Ha'azinu is comprised of a poem describing the consequences of Israel's anticipated betrayal of God, a real negative prediction on the part of Moshe. The poem emphasizes God's faithfulness and Israel's betrayal. God brought the people into the desert, to the promised land, and the people squander the opportunity and forget God. In a measure-for-measure punishment, God withdraws from Israel and they suffer from war and natural disasters. God only saves Israel from total destruction in order to prevent the enemy from claiming credit for itself. The end of the parsha, however, focuses on instructions for Moshe's departure from this world, and this will be the focus of today's conversation. My partner today is a returning guest, last on for our Parshat and More episode this year, Rabbanit Dr. Jennie Rosenfeld. Hi, Jennie.
Hi.
Is currently working on a book of responsa on Judaism and sexuality through Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and she teaches at MTVA. Previously, she served for 5 years as a manhiga ruchanit in Efrat, where she also directed the Rabbinic Court for Financial Matters. She co-authored Et Le'ehov, The Newlywed's Guide to Physical Intimacy, which came out in English in 2011 and in Hebrew in 2013. It's great to have you back.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
I loved our previous episode. We spoke about marital prohibitions for Kohanim. That was a really interesting topic, and I'm sure it touched a lot of people. And today we want to talk about an equally light topic, which is the death of Moshe. The death of Moshe takes up a really significant portion of not just this parsha, but it's really spread out in a few parshiot. The death of Moshe will, of course, take place literally at the end of the Torah, but there's quite a bit of preparation for it. And so why don't you bring us into the way that the prep that we have in the end of this week's Parsha?
Okay, yeah. So I'm going to read a couple of psukim from the Maftir, where the psukim come back to talking about the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, and I want to just note something really interesting about them. So it says, "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe be'etzem hayom hazeh lemor, alei el har ha'avarim hazeh har nevo, asher be'eretz Moav, asher al pnei Yerecho, ure'ei et eretz Canaan, asher ani noten livnei Yisrael la'achuzah." He's asking Moshe to do active things. Go up to Har ha'avarim, look at the land, umut bahar, asher ata oleh shama, and die. And Hashem says that in Lashon of Tzivui, commanding Moshe, as if it's almost in Moshe's control. Then you die. V'ha'asef alamecha kasher meta aron achicha. I think what's really interesting here is that Hashem speaks to Moshe and is asking for his active participation in his own death.
I think that's very striking. Also, I have to say there's something very, very beautiful about the fact that the death of Moshe is being connected to the death of Aaron, as if that's the reunion that Moshe is waiting for, right? They're this really moving set of brothers that we meet, right? It's this shock because all the brothers we met in the book of Reshit hate each other essentially, and they're in competition. And Moshe and Aaron, the Midrash points this out as well, Moshe and Aaron is sort of our first set of brothers who aren't like that, even though it's the exact same story where the younger brother outshines the older one, and they have the exact same paradigm. So I think that it's also so moving that not only does he have to be active, but it's almost and he's waiting for this reunion with his brother Aaron. They love each other in their life and in their death, which I think is also a really interesting point here. So what do we think about the active piece? Why is that? Why do you think that that's specific to Moshe, or is it just because he's such an important figure, so we have emphasis on the process?
Right. I mean, I think I think if you look at Moshe, and I think we're all maybe more familiar with Parshat Va'etchanan, where Moshe is in a mode of resistance, resisting his fate, resisting the fact that he's not going to be allowed into Eretz Yisrael. I think that there's a process that he undergoes to move from that fighting to an acceptance. And I think, I don't know, maybe especially at this time of year, trying to think about what can we learn from that acceptance of one's death and sort of active embracing of it.
I think Elizabeth Kubler-Ross could have done her research on Moshe Rabbeinu, right? The 5 stages of grief.
Okay.
So we have the 5 stages of grief, and Parshat Va'etchanan is the denial piece, right? It's the piece of, I'm going to fight this. I don't want this to wash over me.
Right.
And obviously here Moshe has reached a very different place vis-a-vis his death.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, it's interesting to see he fights, and we know Moshe Rabbeinu from the beginning of when we see him as like a fighter, right? At the sneh, he's already arguing with God, and then really throughout his leadership, he's always, fighting on behalf of Bnei Israel. Hashem wants to destroy them. Moshe is standing up for them. So he's always fighting. I think that's his usual mode, which is why the acceptance here is so much stranger. And I think, from the psukim that I've looked at, there's a big gap between Parshat Va'etchanan, where you see him fighting, and then it's really in the beginning of Parshat Vayelech that we hear him coming to more of an acceptance of his fate. At the beginning of the parsha, it says, "Vayomer alehem ben me'ah ve'esrim shana anochi hayom lo uchal od latzeit v'lavo ve'Hashem amar elai lo ta'avor et hayarden hazeh." So this is already the day of his 120th birthday, so it's mamash the day of his death. Mm-hmm. But he acknowledges, Hashem told me I'm not going to go into Eretz Yisrael, and there seems to be more of an acceptance, which is followed through a few psukim later, where Moshe actually, Vayikra Moshe Yoshua, Vayomer elav le'enei kol Yisrael chazak ve'ematz. That Moshe calls Yoshua and actually transfers the leadership over to him, which is, I think, a very active statement of acceptance or of peace.
Yeah, I'm always so struck by, I guess, what we would call preparation for Moshe's death, meaning we'll think a little bit more about the actual death itself. Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a set of stages that happen in terms of how Moshe, along with God, obviously, are preparing the world to continue after he's here. Now, that itself is an unbelievable feat, which many people, because of their concept or their understanding of how great they are on the world, have a very hard time doing, right? Part of what we see, I believe that the statement at the end of his life about his humility, mm-hmm. part of that is best displayed through all of these prakim at the end, where he has his successor, who was appointed already a while ago. We learned about Yoshua already a while ago in the book of Bamidbar, but here at the actual moment where he's passing over the baton. And mm-hmm. and we have also reading out the Torah, right, where Moshe says, look, this is the most important project I was ever part of. Let me read this out to you. Let me give it to you. It's no longer mine. It's not meant to be mine forever. Mm-hmm. And you have this process where it's not just here's my successor, but also here's sort of a whole hierarchy of leadership. It reminds us, I think, a lot of the Shoftim and that whole process of making a judiciary system that he makes because each row, sort of nudged mm-hmm. him to. So here, God nudges him and says, you're going to die. And Moshe really puts together a whole system of leadership that's going to be able to hold up this thing called Torah, even when he's gone. And we know, I don't even have to name them, but modern examples of pretty famous leaders who weren't able to do this or resisted doing this because they perceived their place as being something that wasn't going to be replaceable once they were dead, or maybe they thought they wouldn't die, etc. But meaning, mm-hmm. it's an unbelievable thing to be, I think, essentially the greatest leader of all time. And yes, with God's urging, and once he accepts his fate, to say, okay, but there's going to be, I don't want to leave a vacuum in my wake, and here's a system I'm going to put together.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a tremendous act of gadlut, and also an act of humility, which is who he is.
I also think the hakel, which we spoke about that in last week's episode, but even the bringing the mitzvah of hakel here in the end of Parshat Vayelech, I think, is also, because it's not just here's the upper echelons of society, here's Yoshua, here's the Zkenim, but dafka, the mitzvah of, I would say, the most equal opportunity mitzvah, right, of the men, the women, and the children also happens now, meaning I'm going to die, but this Torah, this is everybody's Torah. And I think that while we look at it kind of separately, and I didn't mention this in last week's episode, I think it has to be looked at in sort of in this preparation for Moshe's death. We definitely have a mitzvah where everybody's going to take part in the Torah.
Maybe we'll think a little bit about what does it mean to accept one's fate and accept one's death. Because I think that what you were saying about a leader and transferring the leadership and the ego that often gets in the way, Moshe doesn't have that, but there's sort of something beyond that that he has in terms of accepting his death, accepting a decree that seems to so many unfair, that seemed to Moshe unfair. I know my grandmother, Aleh Shalom, when she was in her late 90s, like developed a very strong connection with Moshe Rabbeinu, and just, questioning how could it be that he wasn't allowed into Eretz Yisrael after all he did. But be that as it may, he himself does come to accept it. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a passage in the Gemara in Bava Batra, Daf Tet Vav Amud Aleph, where there's a machloket, a dispute about who is it who wrote the last verses of the Torah. Was it Yoshua? Was it Moshe? We have basically two problems. On the one hand, the problem of, how could someone other than Moshe be writing a part of the Torah? On the other hand, the last 8 verses of the Torah, in which Moshe dies, and then there's a few more psukim, it would seem impossible for Moshe himself to write it.
Because it says, Vayamot Sham Moshe Eved Hashem Be'eretz Moav, right? That's
exactly.
Hey in the last parak. And then there's, as you said, another many psukim about him being buried, about Yoshua. And so the question is he writing that while he's still alive, or what's happening there?
It seems illogical.
Yeah.
But the Gemara says, it can't, the opinion of Rabbi Shimon is that it can't be that the Sefer Torah that Moshe wrote was not complete. Mm. And so he says that Moshe wrote the rest of the Torah in a regular way. And those last 8 psukim, he wrote in a different way. He says, Mikan va'elach HaKadosh Baruch Hu omer u'Moshe kotev b'dema. Which literally means that those last 8 psukim of his death and afterwards, Moshe wrote b'dema, with tears. And I think that in seeing that approach, that Moshe actually wrote his own death, it highlights that active acceptance of Moshe, acceptance to the point of dying, of agreeing to die, of writing it. Of writing it through the tears.
I want to take Rabbi Shimon's opinion and sort of take apart some of the assumptions that are in it. One is that there's no way that Moshe wouldn't have completed the Torah, which I think is a fascinating thing. I know, because we have this concept of Torah Moshe Misinai, and that like it's all of it, but I think there's also like a philosophical statement of saying it can't be that Moshe's gift wasn't completed, even though what do we often say about, God creates man, but man isn't completed until a Brit Milah. I'm just saying, like, we even sometimes say that God's creations are incomplete, but it's interesting that at the base of that idea is that whatever Moshe, the Torah he gave us, wouldn't be completed. And also this question about what are the tears from? Why is he crying because he's sad about his death? Or maybe he's also crying because he has to write all of these really intense psukim about how amazing he is at the end. And there's also something really, really uncomfortable for Moshe, right? If he's really so enough, it's really awkward to write those kind of passages. And I think that that's also, I wonder sometimes, I usually think about his tears as because he's writing about his own death. But I wonder actually if that's the only source. There's also something that comes to mind with the idea of writing with tears. Like, it makes me think of disappearing ink, right? Yeah. So my question is he writing while crying, or is he, right? Because when I was younger and learned that Gemara, I thought he was writing
with his tears. Yes.
Right? Yeah. But I think it likely is that he's writing with writing regularly and crying at the same time. But I always had this image of like disappearing ink, and then Moshe, and then Yoshua maybe comes and fills it in, which is another opinion in the Gemara as well.
Right. I guess I just also want to acknowledge that here we are sitting in Yerushalayim, Ir HaKodesh, 2 regular people, and I think that there's something today maybe that's harder to understand because Eretz Yisrael feels like it's part of everyone's life. Either we live here or people come and visit, from America and the entire diaspora. But just that feeling of Moshe Rabbeinu, who he was, the leader that he was, and he never came here.
Yeah.
And that, and I see that, I guess, as like a lot of the reason for the tears. Like it's this place that he was in the Midbar
for not getting here.
Yeah, for 40 years
beautiful.
in the Midbar, going somewhere and then being stuck at this limit of like he can see it, and he won't ever walk on that soil.
Rabbi Sachs has a great formulation of this. He says he sort of has a list of all these different lessons we learn from the death of Moshe. And the first one he writes, this is in his parsha writings for Vizot HaBracha, for the last parsha of the Torah. He says, for each of us, even the greatest, there is a Jordan we will not cross, a promised land we will not enter, a destination we will not reach. This is what Rabbi Talfon meant when he said, it's not for you to complete the task, en alecha malacha ligmor, but neither are you free to desist from it. When what we begin, others will continue. What matters is that we undertook the journey, we did not stand still. I think that you've highlighted that, like the him taking the journey piece. I mean, not only journey, obviously, in leading Am Yisrael, but even taking the journey to activate his own death, essentially. But I think that, Moshe is the most extreme example of that he didn't get to do the thing he wanted to do. He didn't get to Eretz Yisrael. But I think that we see that similar idea really echoing in all the Avot, right? All of our, right? A founding father or a founding figure essentially is someone who starts something but doesn't finish it, right? They're not the one who's in the developmental stage. I'm thinking about even the idea that Terach tried to get to Canaan and he doesn't, and Abraham continues that, or Yaakov ending his life in Mitzrayim, right, and not ending it in Canaan, which would have been sort of like a calmer ending to that story. And I think that Moshe, again, is the most extreme example of this, but it's a very, very powerful and painful dugma of holding back, of not getting the thing that somebody wants the most.
Right.
Which, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it also can raise the question for us, maybe in the season that we're in the Yamim Noraim, of a question of like, when do you keep fighting? When do you keep trying? Yes. And this is in all areas of self-improvement, of goals that one has for themselves. Like when do you keep pushing? And when is there a point of realization? Maybe I've reached a certain limit, or maybe this isn't for me.
I think also a lot of the choices that Chazal make about what passages we read on Rosh Hashanah specifically, and the Haftorot, right? So many of them focus on women and desire to have children, which I think fertility, and recognizing this could be a trigger for anybody listening, but fertility is a topic that brings this to the fore almost most intensely in life. We're talking about death and accepting that, or illness, but the topic of that, of how much do you fight, right? How much ishtadlut, how much are you waiting? Are you coming at it from a makom of being broken by it? Or are you coming at it from a space of, I'm accepting whatever happens? Like, I think that Chazal choose to bring us that tension on Rosh Hashanah specifically, because it's the day that God birthed the world, and there's so many images like that in our tefillot. But I think that's like the flip side of this idea also that we read about in so many ways also on Rosh Hashanah. Yeah,
in terms of in today's world feeling like there's so much that's in our control, or that's in our hands, or that we can do, but at some point, again, whether it's issues of life, death, illness, reaching that limit of.
Totally.
I think also that for some people, death can be a motivating factor. I mean, we have it in the Mishnah in terms of, a person should imagine the day of their death, and that could motivate them to somehow live their life differently. I want to acknowledge that it's definitely not an approach for everyone, and for some people it could either be paralyzing or just not motivating. But there's a very interesting passage in the Piasetzner's writing, Reb Clonimus Kalman Shapira, the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, most famous for the Sefer Eish Kodesh, Chovas HaTalmidim, and he has, in a lesser known Sefer of his, B'nai Machshava Tova, a visualization of the day of one's death. He has a lot of visualizations and meditative techniques in his Sfarim, but he gives a visualization of the day of one's death as as a way of motivating people to live their life differently. And I won't read it inside in its details, but he does paint the scene of a person's funeral with the person themselves sort of hovering from above and seeing the scene of the grief, the mourning, and being unable to do anything.
I just want to say that you don't want to read it inside, which is fine. And I don't mind putting myself out there. But I think that these are very normal thoughts that I think many people have. I mean, I don't think I'm so crazy, which is why I don't mind saying it in the public forum. I think that many of us think that. And I think that living in Israel in the past 2 years has brought out, and a lot has been written about this also, like brought out in very, not for paranoid ways, or not because someone had a traumatic experience as a child. Like I think many spouses, I don't think we're the only ones, have, first of all, many people have written wills, and many spouses have had conversations that maybe they wouldn't have necessarily had in a different time, but it's kind of felt like it's knocked on our door so many times in the past 2 years that even if you're not someone like me, I think that many people have done this, and I don't think that it's so crazy at all.
Right. So I guess my question is, as someone who doesn't necessarily spend much time thinking about my own mortality, maybe I should.
No, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend it. Yeah.
Is how does it really motivate us? I guess I relate more to the paralyzing sense of like, oh my gosh, if I'm thinking that at any moment I can die, I'll just, there's so much that I'll want to do, so much that I'll want to pack into each moment that I'll just be paralyzed and be unable to do anything. Is there a way that thinking about the imminence of our death can be productive and constructive?
You asking me on a personal level? I'm perfectly happy to answer.
Yeah, I'm asking that.
I think that, first of all, I'll also put in there, my listeners know, like I also watched my father pass away, and that was 9 years ago. And so that was also something that like you learn a lot through these very hard experiences. And I think that it's Dafka created a certain calm, but I think that it's created, a certain level of like an acceptance. And I think that it's like, if I use even just like a phrase, but it kind of bolds all the colors around you in life. Like I think it heightens the day to day, and it heightens the gratitude. Like that ends up being the only response to it, is like live every day to its fullest, and just to be grateful, like do your best, and also be grateful of everything that is. And I think that that's what the acceptance looks like. Acceptance, as you're saying so beautifully, isn't a passivity. It's definitely an active choice to live life intentionally. And I think that's what I've taken with me through, again, these thoughts that I realized were embedded in me from a young age, and just that were heightened definitely with my father. And in the past 2 years, I feel like it's been, jumped up many, many levels. And I think that I totally get the idea that it's paralyzing. And I'm not saying that like they're joyful thoughts, but I do think that they can create a certain degree. They do. For me, it's create a certain degree of like calm and acceptance, dafka. And so when those thoughts come up and I say, doing the best I can, you know what I mean? Like I'm doing the best I can to do the most I can. And beyond that, I have no control. It's dafka calm, that control piece for me. I can't speak about anybody else listening. Right.
So, I mean, that's amazing. And I think that sounds like it could be a challenge for those of us who don't totally identify, to think during this season in just a different way about those thoughts.
So what does he tell us?
So, I mean, he paints the scene very, very clearly of a person, and it's interesting because it seems as if he's almost speaking about a person after their death, looking and almost being a silent visitor at their own funeral, sort of hovering from above.
This is so familiar to me.
Yeah? Okay, wow. And watching the funeral take place. And I think just like seeing that his children surround him with the sound of their weeping, and his loved ones, it's this very surreal scene that I can almost imagine, most of us feeling like, there's something that we haven't yet done that we wish we would have done, in seeing that scene, maybe even seeing at the funeral who's there. Oh, this person, I didn't call them in such a long time. I didn't, it sort of brings out, maybe brings out the more that we could have done while we were still alive, but now it's too late.
But it also can give you a plan, meaning when you think about that David Brooks made famous, the idea of the eulogy traits, meaning what are the things you'll actually want people to say about you when you're no longer in this world. But that can help people, it can really embolden them to do better work on a day-to-day, meaning when they realize, oh, well, the things I'm valuing or that I'm putting first are not the things that I actually want people to remember about me. And so imagining that scene can help sort of focus people on the work that they want to do today. And I think that's where he's going with this. Or even, who do I want to be there? Who do I want to be the people crying, right? Who do I want to have made impact on? I think that that's also part of it, is sort of thinking about, yes, like what legacy are you leaving in the world? And by the way, that's what's so striking, if you go back to Moshe for a minute, about the fact that no one is ever supposed to know where he's buried. And we see the flip side of that in a different kind of leader, but we have Gidon, right? Gidon, who makes an ephod, he makes some sort of a shrine, and then it becomes a point of worship after he dies, and that was so commonplace in the ancient world, and it's so unbelievable, right? That Moshe is our greatest leader and has this legacy, but we never ever want his legacy to be something that's worshipped later. We want to remember it. We want it to be a lesson for us. But ultimately, the biggest fulfillment of Moshe's mission is that we keep the Torah. It's not about him, right? That's the most important part about his death.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I also just want to put out there and say, I think that there's a way, thinking now during the Yamim Noraim, that a person can live a meaningful life in a different way without those thoughts. I hear what you're saying in terms of the motivation that sort of an imagined funeral or the eulogy traits can give a person. But I think that there's also another way of living, equally valid, which is a living life in the here and now, and obviously people are different, and for some people, thinking of the Yom HaMita will be a motivating factor. For others, it won't. But I think that each person has the potential in their own way to make their current life meaningful, and the thoughts that it's going to take to create that are going to be different for everyone. But we can reach that same sort of goal of a meaningful life in many different ways.
I think we also see some of the dovetailing of those two approaches. They come up very much in this season. I'm going to grab your knife.
Yeah.
They come up very much in the way that we look at Rosh Hashanah as, the Gemara also talks about, like, how is it that we're standing there and singing in front of God on the day that he's judging us, right? We're constantly sort of holding within us emotions that one might look at as being paradoxical, or that they don't work together.
Right. I mean, there is that tension, whether we call it the tension between ahava and yira, love and fear, in terms of two modes of avodat Hashem, the pasuk, v'gilu b'ra'ada, to rejoice while trembling. There's a tension that's sort of embedded in these days. And I actually think about it as someone who made Aliyah, as the difference between the tefillot of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in Chutz La'aretz and in Eretz Yisrael. So not making this as a scientific statement, but
many have observed it, so go for it.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah. Anecdotally, the Yamim Noraim of my youth, it was a davening of crying, of sadness.
It was scary,
somber tunes, and like you spoke before about the writing with tears, the tears, lining the machzor and the crumbly pages. That was, to me, the Yamim Noraim that I grew up with. And then I came here to Eretz Yisrael and was sort of shocked at the joy and the upbeat tunes and the, dancing, just the joy that went through the tefillah. And I remember thinking to myself, my first year here, oh my gosh, someone can make it through, Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur and not cry.
I think it's interesting. I maybe want to connect it. This is only a suggestion. I cannot prove this, but I think that, first of all, there are both. And I, have also been through many seasons here, and you have that sort of the joy that people feel. I would say, by the way, you also see the very big difference in weddings in Chutz La'aretz versus Israel. In Israel, it's all jumping and joy and everyone's, singing out loud, and there's it's just much more alive in that sense. And the weddings in Chutz La'aretz are much more of a somber affair, sort of serious, not because they're sad, God forbid, but there's something much more solemn. That's the right word. There's much more solemn about them. And it's interesting whether it has to do with the way people express themselves in different countries. It interests me whether that's like a reflection maybe of even like kind of like Christian ceremonies in the way that those are experienced. But if we could bring it back to what we spoke about earlier, I think that many people all over the world have learned to live with this concept of Yom Hadin, whether that's Rosh Hashanah or death, but there's something particularly intense about life in Israel. And I think that we are constantly aware, there's a certain existential awareness here that something could always happen, that I think that sometimes I believe that the joyful sort of mitparitz, the gil that you see is kind of a trait that's been honed in on a lot of us to say, we don't have control over this. And so therefore, I'm not davening so that I make sure that I make it through this year alive, but meaning I'm going to take this moment, and there's more of like the coronation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu somewhat than there is the please let me live another year. I believe that there's something almost like in the DNA of how we all exist here that kind of shifts that piece. There's like a certain vibrancy of life because there is something that kind of always hovers. Now that thing hovers always for all of humanity, but I think that sometimes we just might be a little bit more, we might be living it in full color in that sense in Israel because of the threat that constantly exists here. Yeah. All a suggestion. I cannot prove any of that. It's just a sense in my heart.
No, I think that makes so much sense. And especially in these past 2 years, I think even more strongly, sort of that death awareness it's always there. And so we sort of don't need to have the Yamim Noraim be the time where we're suddenly thinking about it and going to be somber about it, but because it's sort of always in the background, we can just, we can rejoice.
We need it though for the tshuva season. I'm not saying that anyone has a p'tor from the idea of Yom Hadin, but I'm just saying that I think there's something in the atmosphere that is different. And I think it also connects to the general, a little bit more just like mishuchrar. It's a bit more like freed, unencumbered kind of vibe that can go on, the less formalistic. Like I think that there's a lot of elements. I don't think it's only that kind of like psychological reading.
Right.
But I really have a deep sense that it's part of it.
Yeah. As you're speaking, I'm just thinking the song that's very prominent here in Israel of Hamelech Basadeh, and which, at least when I was in America, wasn't sung at all. It's sort of
the king is in the fields.
The king. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. It works nicely with that idea because it's all about Hashem is out there. This is your chance to go and build a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Yeah. And it's sort of, I don't know that it takes away from the deen aspect, but it does take away from the somberness to say, Hamelech Basadeh, let me go out there and build an unmediated relationship. Yeah, exactly. It's an opportunity. And so let's be happy. Let's rejoice in the opportunity. And I feel like the two approaches are there. Obviously, it's not one or the other. But I think that for each person, one or the other might work in bringing them forward. So ultimately, I think it's that there's different options of how we can connect in the Yamim Noraim, and that's a good thing because people are different and people need different modes of Avodat Hashem to be able to tap into.
Yeah, I love this. I like how we started from Moshe and we spoke about his approach, right? Both on one hand that he was naturally a fighter and not going to accept things easily, and that we see initially that natural response to the decree from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he won't be able to go into Eretz Yisrael, but that there is a process. Right? We've seen in many ways, as we now are winding down the Torah, we've seen in many ways the processes that Moshe has gone through, but in his leadership, in his own relationship to his family, there's a lot of different processes that Moshe has undergone. And no less so vis-a-vis his own death and his need to depart from the world. And I think that there are so many lessons that we gain from that, and that we've also really been able to think a little bit about the tone of this time of year, that as we're saying, it shifts in different places. It shifts from year to year. When someone is approaching these chagim with a very deep personal need or lack, it's going to definitely impact their tefillah versus another year where things are kind of calm and they're able to maybe take up more space inside of themselves for the thoughts about Am Yisrael, right? We're presenting them as either or, but obviously these things they coexist together. There's no real dichotomies here. They're all that we're living with them with different tensions or with these different these different heart spaces in different amounts inside of us each year. So I want to thank you for coming and thinking with us today and giving us those ideas to take with us into the final days of this season.
Yeah, and I guess just blessing all of Am Yisrael, and especially in Eretz Yisrael, with Tichle Shana v'Kileloteha, Tachel Shana u'Birchoteha, that this I feel like we said it last year and are still saying it in the same way this year.
Thanks so much.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.